December 1948. A beach near Adelaide, South Australia. A well-dressed man is found dead against the sea wall, sitting almost upright on the sand. He carries no wallet, no identification. Every label has been cut from his clothes. He has been dead for decades, and the world still does not know his name. In a hidden fob pocket of his trousers, sewn shut, is a tiny scrap of paper torn from a book. On it, 2 words: Tamam Shud. And inside the book it came from, found later in a stranger's car, is a line of letters that no codebreaker has ever solved. On the morning of December 1st, 1948, the body of a man was found on Somerton beach, a stretch of coast just south of the city of Adelaide, in the state of South Australia. He had been seen the evening before. People on the beach the previous night had noticed a man in roughly that spot, resting against the sea wall. Some recalled seeing him move an arm. Most assumed he was simply asleep or drunk and left him alone. By morning, he was dead. He appeared to be middle-aged. He was, by every account, in good physical condition, fit, strong, well cared for. He was dressed neatly, in a suit, as if for an ordinary day in the city. And almost immediately, the case became strange. The man carried no wallet. He carried no papers. He had no identification of any kind. There was nothing on his body that gave a name, an address, or a reason for him to be there. And then investigators noticed something deliberate. The labels had been removed from his clothing. The tags that would normally identify a maker, a tailor, a place of purchase, cut out, carefully, as if someone had wanted to make absolutely certain that this man could not be traced. He had on him a handful of ordinary items: cigarettes, matches, chewing gum, a comb, the small contents of an ordinary man's pockets. Everything, in other words, except the one thing every person normally carries without thinking: some trace of who they were. The first task in any case like this is the simplest one: find out who the dead man is. In the Somerton man case, that simple task failed completely. Investigators did everything the era allowed. They circulated descriptions. They published details. They took and shared images in the hope of recognition. His fingerprints were recorded and sent out widely for comparison. People came forward. Over the months and years, a number of individuals were put forward as the possible identity of the man on the beach. Relatives of missing men came to look. None of it held. Every proposed identification eventually fell apart. The fingerprints matched no record. The man remained, officially, unknown. A medical examination only deepened the mystery. The man appeared healthy. He had the calves, some observers noted, of someone used to a great deal of walking, or, it was sometimes suggested, of a dancer. His teeth had unusual features, and the cause of death was not clear. There were no obvious injuries consistent with violence. The pathologist who examined him came to suspect that the man had been poisoned, that something had been introduced into his body that the tests of 1948 could not identify and could not rule out. So this is where the case stood after the first weeks. A healthy, well-dressed man, no name, no labels, no clear cause of death, and a quiet, growing suspicion that he had been deliberately killed.
Months into the investigation, as the man's clothing was being examined again, someone found something that had been missed. Sewn into the waistband of the man's trousers was a small fob pocket, the kind of tiny pocket sometimes used for a watch. And this one had been stitched closed. Inside it was a tightly rolled scrap of paper. When the scrap was unrolled, it carried just 2 printed words: Tamam Shud. The phrase was identified as coming from a famous work of poetry, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a collection of verses translated into English and widely known. The words Tamam Shud appear at the very end of the text. They mean, in effect, ended or finished. The final words of the book had been cut out, rolled up, and hidden in a secret pocket on the body of a dead man. Investigators now needed the specific book that this scrap had been torn from. They appealed to the public. They asked if anyone had a copy of the Rubaiyat with the final words missing from the last page. And a copy turned up. A man came forward and said that some time earlier he had found a copy of the Rubaiyat in his car, left, he said, in the back of the vehicle, which had been parked near Somerton beach around the relevant period. The book was examined. The torn final page matched. The scrap from the hidden pocket had come from that exact copy. And then, when investigators looked closely at the book itself, they found that it was not blank. On the inside of the recovered copy of the Rubaiyat, faintly, someone had written. There were 2 things of note. The first was a telephone number. When investigators followed it, it led to a woman who lived not far from Somerton beach. We will come back to her. The second thing was a sequence of letters. Written faintly in the book were several lines of capital letters, grouped into what looked like words, but spelling nothing in any ordinary sense. Some letters were crossed out. The lines did not read as plain English, or as plain anything. To investigators, it looked like a code, a cipher, a message written in some deliberately concealed form. And so the letters were sent to people whose work was breaking codes. Cryptographers. Code experts, including, over the years, military and intelligence specialists. None of them could break it. Decades of effort have been spent on those few faint lines of letters. Professional code breakers have studied them. Amateur enthusiasts have studied them. Modern analysts with modern tools have studied them. And there is, to this day, no agreed solution. Some experts have concluded that the letters may not be a cipher at all, that they could be, for instance, the first letters of the words of a remembered phrase, or something written for private reasons, that were never meant to be a message to anyone. But the lines remain. A few rows of capital letters, written faintly in a book of poetry, linked to the body of a man with no name, and after all this time, still unread. The telephone number, written in the Rubaiyat, led, as we said, to a woman who lived near Somerton beach. When investigators spoke to her, she gave them an account involving a copy of the same book. She said that some years earlier, she had given a copy of the Rubaiyat to a man she had known, a man who, as it happened, was alive and could be accounted for. So the immediate obvious thread
that the dead man was the person she had given the book to did not lead where it first seemed it might. But there was a moment that observers at the time found difficult to forget. At one stage of the investigation, the woman was shown a cast that had been made of the dead man's features, and according to those present, her reaction was striking. By their account, she appeared deeply shaken, so affected that some who saw it came away convinced that she had recognised the man or knew something she was not saying. But she did not identify him. She did not give investigators a name. And being shaken by the cast of a dead man's face is not, by itself, proof of anything at all. The woman's connection to the case became one of its most discussed features. For decades, people studying the Somerton man have argued about what her reaction meant, whether she was central to the mystery or simply a frightened person caught at its edge. She is one more figure in a case full of them. Someone who seemed, for a moment, to hold a thread, and who left the record without ever pulling it. For most of the time since 1948, the Somerton man had no name at all. He was buried in Adelaide under a headstone that simply marked him as an unknown man. His grave became, in its own quiet way, a known place, a stop for people drawn to the mystery. But the case never closed in the minds of the people who kept returning to it. Researchers spent years on the question. They examined the man's physical features. They studied old photographs. They pursued the theory that given the era, the late 1940s, the early Cold War, and given the deliberate removal of every label, the hidden code, and the unidentified poison, the Somerton man might have been someone involved in espionage. That theory has never been proven, but it is easy to see why it took hold. A fit, anonymous man, every trace of identity stripped away, a concealed cipher, a suspected untraceable poison, dead on a beach in the opening years of the Cold War. In the modern era, the long effort reached a new stage. The man's remains were exhumed so that modern forensic methods, including DNA analysis, could be applied to a case that 1948 had no tools to solve. Researchers used that genetic material, together with genealogical methods, to build out a family tree, and proposed on that basis a possible identity for the man on the beach. But that proposed identification, while widely reported, has not been universally accepted as a final, official closing of the case. It is a candidate, a strong-looking lead, not, in the eyes of every authority, a settled fact. And even if the name is one day fully confirmed, it would answer only the first question. It would not tell us how he died. It would not tell us what the code meant. It would not tell us why a man would be sent to a beach with his name cut out of his clothes. The Somerton man has been dead for the better part of 80 years. For almost all of that time, he was a man with no history at all. No childhood anyone could point to. No family who came with certainty to claim him. No story before the evening he sat down against a seawall. He became instead something close to a legend. His case has been written about for decades. It has drawn in code breakers, historians, scientists, and ordinary people who simply could not let the puzzle rest. And it endured because of how complete the mystery was. Most unidentified body cases are mysteries only of identity. The Somerton man was a mystery of identity, of cause of death, of a hidden message and of intent, all at once. Whoever cut the labels from his clothes understood exactly what they were doing. They were trying to make a man disappear while leaving his body in plain view. And for the better part of a century, it worked. If modern science has truly recovered his name, then one of the longest-standing anonymous body cases in the world may finally have a person at its centre. But a name is only the first line of a file. The rest of the Somerton man's file, the how, the why, the meaning of those faint capital letters, is still, after all this time, mostly blank. Nearly 8 decades after a man was found dead on Somerton beach, the case is still, in every way that matters, open. Modern science may have given investigators a strong candidate for who he was, but the case was never only about a name. It was about a man found neatly dressed and lifeless against a sea wall, with no wallet, no papers, and every label cut from his clothing. It was about a suspected poison that the science of the day could not identify. It was about 2 words hidden in a sewn pocket, Tamam Shud, and a line of letters no one has ever read. The obstacles now are severe. The witnesses are gone. The original investigators are gone. The era itself has passed out of living memory. What endures is the shape of it. A healthy man with no identity, a book of poetry missing its final words, a code that has defeated every expert who has tried it, and a death that no one has ever fully explained. We may never know how the Somerton man died. We may never know what those faint capital letters were meant to say. But we know someone tried to erase him. We know they hid 2 words against his body. We know they wrote something down that was never meant to be understood. And that, for as long as cold cases are remembered, is what keeps the file open, even when the tide has long gone out. Chalkline file doesn't promise you answers. Sometimes the file is open for 80 years. Sometimes the dead man arrives with his name already gone. A well-dressed man was found against a sea wall near Adelaide on a summer morning in 1948. He had no wallet, no papers, and no labels in his clothes. In a hidden pocket were 2 words torn from a book of poetry. What we have 80 years later is a suspected poison no one could name, a line of letters no codebreaker could solve, a witness who seemed to recognise a face she would not name, and a modern identification that not everyone accepts. If you know something the file does not, a name, a recollection, a story carried in a family from someone who knew a man missing in Australia in 1948, every detail still matters, even now, even 80 years on. Cold cases stay cold until they don't. This was the Somerton man file.